On April 30th, 1998, a group of scientists were sent to a mysterious horseshoe-shaped island close to the Antarctic Peninsula. For one young scientist, a man named Richard Long, this expedition didn't just subject him to an unfathomable cold, it exposed him to a darkness, one that latched onto human misery and fed upon it. This is Richard's account of what happened on that chilling island, Deception Island.
I've been working in the lab in Washington for about a year as a marine biologist. I've always been fascinated by animals. Ever since I was a little kid, my grandparents took me to the zoo. I knew I didn't just want to work with them. I wanted to find out everything there was to discover about their evolution and survival. And one day in June, these people in suits arrived at the lab, professional looking, government types. The next thing I knew, my boss was pulling me aside and telling me I'd be joining a group of 5 scientists on an isolated island full of my favorite animal, chinstrap penguins, as well as fascinating ecosystems. And well, I thought it sounded exciting. I left the following week. 3 of the scientists had arrived a few days earlier to set up our camp in this old military base that had somehow avoided the various volcano eruptions. So it was just me and a scientist named Farah on the ship. After a few failed conversations, I didn't have to be Einstein to see she wasn't the talkative type. I left her and I went up the deck and I sat there and I watched as my surroundings seemed to ice over around me, and that island of ice and rock came into view, and it left me speechless. I'd never seen anything like it before. And before I took the first step onto the island, I felt it in my core. I don't know how, but I knew it then. I knew that life would never be the same again. I could have turned back, but I didn't. I still took that step. I followed Farah across the island, as she seemed to know where she was going, my rucksack rattling behind me as I walked. The coldness was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. It cut through my insulated gloves and hat and seemed to gnaw at my flesh. At least that's what it felt like. My teeth chattered for the entire walk. We'd been moving for about an hour, and I was feeling the burn. We were far beyond the fence borders that the general public weren't permitted to cross, and everything seemed darker there, and somehow colder. I don't know. Something about it gave me the shivers, and it wasn't just from the cold. I was knocking ice dirt from my boots when I swear I saw it, over by some rocks. It was creeping around them, looking at me. It was a blurred face, but there was something not right about it. My heart raced, but when I looked again, they'd gone. I thought about saying something to Farah, but she was already at least 50 steps ahead of me, and from her constant glares and sighs, agitated by my slowness. So I put it down to my imagination and fatigue, and carried on. Even though I knew in my heart that I saw what I saw. A bit further along, Farah was there, her arms folded and waiting for me. I apologized for being slow, but she told me she wanted to show me something. I followed her down this icy slope, thinking she just wanted to see me fall on my... Then I saw it. The narrow gap in the rock surface. A cave. I followed her inside and we saw icicles hanging from the ceiling, but there was this flat segment of the wall, covered in this thick sheet of almost translucent ice. There was something behind it, preserved in the ice. Farah held her flashlight up to it to get a better look. It looked like symbols, and they were red, and I don't know if it was just the light or the ice or something, but they looked like they had this dusty texture to them. It was kinda incredible, but it also gave me the creeps. Farah mentioned it was impressive, and she actually smiled. I could tell how stoked she was to find it, and for the walk to base we talked and talked about what it could be. She told me not to mention it to the others just yet, and I agreed. I didn't blame her for wanting to keep it to herself, and I guess I didn't want to get on her bad side so early on in our mission. We arrived at base, and although it wasn't much, it was something. We had a generator for power. We had a small but efficient lab, and we had our own rooms. It was a pretty cool setup in an old school, deserted island sort of way, like something straight out of a movie. I met the rest of the group. Top dog Mason, the tech guy Kurt, and the geologist Lev. They all seemed friendly enough. I didn't know back then how dark things would get, but I sensed something wasn't right about this place. But I ignored that uneasy, twisted feeling in my gut. But I should have listened to it. Maybe if I had, then things would have been different. For the first few days, I settled into a routine. I would wake up early and walk over to the headland to watch those penguins. I would set up a camera so I wouldn't miss anything. It was fascinating how they thrived in such a desolate place. It was really okay until the third day. And then everything changed. Lev left early without telling anyone and turned in the dead of night with a rucksack filled with I don't know what. When Mason asked where he was out so late and had ignored his radio, he just shrugged and locked himself in the lab for hours, chiseling away at something, but refusing to open the door. The others thought he was just dedicated to his research, but things got worse from then on. And then in the space of a week, the friendly man I'd met my first day was now a virtual recluse. He was also hogging the lab, and he wouldn't let us in it. Kurt tried once, and Lev lost it with him. He claims he threatened him with some weird red rock. And Kurt told Mason about this, but he managed to smooth it over. Told Lev he had to share the lab. I stayed out of there, as something about Lev had definitely changed. I knew that much. Even passing Lev in the hallway was enough to make me feel uneasy. He just seemed unapproachable, different. And then one time, as I left the surveillance room in a hurry, I wasn't looking where I was going, and I bashed straight into Lev. I've apologized, but he didn't say a word. He just flinched his arms as if he was glitching out or something. And then he picked up his tools he dropped and he walked on like nothing had ever happened. Well, I saw something. I saw something in his eye, right there beneath the cornea. This wriggling black form, just the size of a worm. I didn't know what it was, but I definitely knew I saw it. I tried to stay out of Lev's way even more after that. The guy made me feel uneasy. And this all changed when the fog happened. I was out researching when this fog came out of nowhere. The kind that stuck to your skin and caught in your throat. It was as if it was its own life form. I struggled to make it back to base. All the others were already there, apart from Lev. We tried reaching him on his radio, and there was no response. And the hours passed by, and there was no sign of him. Farah wanted to go looking for him, but Kurt was adamant this would be foolish. The fog was so thick now you couldn't even see your own hand in it. Farah wasn't happy about this, but it was Mason's call, and he sided with Kurt. And I have to admit, I was relieved about this, as I didn't want to venture out there in those conditions where frostbite would be the least of my worries. It was about midnight when we heard the thud on the door. Before we could reach it, there was another thud, and then another. It made no sense for Lev not to just let himself in, unless something was wrong. Then I remembered my first day there and the glimpse of that not right face behind the rocks. As Kurt opened the door, I froze in pure fear that whoever or whatever was on the other side wasn't Lev, but someone else. As he opened the door, a gust of cold air swept into the base and revealed the nightshade of fog outside. No one was there. Kurt had a hand on the door and was craning his neck outside. In a voice crackled with cold, he said, "Lev, is that you? Come on, quit messing." I saw him step forward, further maneuvering his head into the unknown. I watched on, my heart pounding as if it knew something I didn't. "Kurt, come on. There's no one there," I said. As I pulled on his arm, it was freezing and I just wanted to close the door and go get warm. Through chattering teeth, he replied, But, I see him. Lev, is that..." Then he jerked forward. My grip loosened on him and he was gone. Something had pulled him into the vastness of fog. I wanted to scream his name, but I couldn't form the words. It was terrifying. And then suddenly, Kurt was thrown back inside and against the wall with such an incredible force. I didn't know what had done that, but I didn't have to wait long for an answer. In stepped Lev. His eyes, now empty voids, except for that small, wriggling black form I spotted in his left eye. "What the hell? You're crazy. Why did you do that?" Kurt shouted at Lev. A look of pure fear etched upon his face. Lev seemed in a trance. He just shook his head and walked past us both as if we weren't even there. He was pulling something behind him. This large bag. It made this clattered, scraping sound as he pulled it along the floor toward the lab. I didn't know what was going on. Kurt was defensive, shrugged it off as nothing. I guess he was embarrassed. He was a big guy and Lev was half his size. He didn't want the others to know he'd been overpowered by him. He told me not to mention it, and then he sulked off to his room. I went and told the others that Lev was back and in the lab, and Mason was relieved. But Farah, she wouldn't stop staring at me. It was as if she smelt the fear on me. She wouldn't leave it, and when I left the room, she followed me and demanded to know what had happened. And I ended up spilling it out to her. Her eyes dilated and the color drained from her face. Then, in a stern voice, she told me she'd sort it and to stay away from the lab. As she walked off, I took it real personal. I thought she didn't want me in the lab, as she didn't value my skills. But I realize now that that's not the case. I think she knew something. Something I didn't know. And she was trying to warn me. I decided to go to my room and check my notes. But I realized I'd left my notebook in the lab. I knew it was on the side table by the door, so I could just reach in and grab it without disturbing Lev. Through the small window on the door, I saw him with his back to me. He was leaning over something and motioning his hand up and down. I presumed it was whatever had been in the bag. I opened the door as quietly as I could and reached for my notebook, but I misplaced my footing and my shoe squeaked across the floor. He immediately turned and looked at me. I saw the chisel in his hand covered in red. At the time, I presumed it was the red dust from whatever rocks he collected, but now I'm not so sure that's all it was. Then I saw his expressionless face and that thing in his left eye, the worm-like black form wriggling there. I saw it clear as day. I lifted my notebook so he knew why I was there, and then backed out of the door. And he nodded, and he turned back to what he was doing. It was as he moved, that's when I heard it. A whimper. He lowered his chisel with brute force, and the whimpering sound immediately stopped. That's when I saw it trickling down the side of the table. A constant flow of red. He was still bashing his arm into it. It sounded like it was hitting something hard, rock, or bone. I veered out of that room feeling sick to my core. Lev was like a man possessed, and I was certain that what he was chiseling away at on that table was far more than just rocks. Rocks don't bleed. I convinced myself it was probably an animal caught up in the rocks. Crazy sounding, I know. But I guess it was easier telling myself this than allowing myself to comprehend that it could be anything else. I locked myself in my room and I tried to forget about it, but chiseling plagued my nightmares. The next day, the lab was empty and spotless. Mason said he'd seen Lev leave early, hauling a bag behind him. He said he was meant to be researching with Farah today, but he was struggling to track her down. And that's when I felt it in my gut again. That feeling that swarmed my mind and assured me something wasn't right. I told Mason what happened the previous night, and he tried to shrug it off. Still, he told me to stay at base today, and then went off to check the lab. I agreed and walked through the base feeling anxious about the whole thing. But I could watch the live penguin footage from the surveillance room, so everything was fine. But when I got there, Kurt was there, staring at the screen. I said, "Hi," but he ignored me and just kept on staring at the screen, blocking my view. But when he finally turned and walked past me, he didn't meet my gaze or acknowledge me at all. Instead, he seemed in a hurry. And that's when I saw it in the corner of his eye, something black, wriggling beneath his cornea. He left the room, and I shut the door. I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know what to do. So I ended up sitting down and watching the live footage. if anything, just to calm myself down. As I watched it, I spotted something red in the ice. Curious. I ended up rewinding the footage, and I stared in complete horror when I saw it. It fitted across the screen and grabbed something, no doubt a penguin, and I saw the blood around its mouth, but all the while it had this unfaltering stare, as if it wasn't aware of itself. But it was a human. Or at least it had been once. It didn't have any clothes on, and its skin, there was no skin. Tendons and muscles exposed in a grotesque vision. I stared at it in disbelief, and then I heard something behind me and turned enough to see Kurt standing there in almost a trance, something gripped in his hand. "You got to see this," I told him just before I felt something whack across the back of my head. As I came in and out of consciousness, I was aware of a dragging sensation. I was being pulled across the cold, hard floor, but at this point, I was too out of it to fathom what was going on. When I finally regained my awareness of what the heck was going on, I realized my arms and legs were bound, and I opened my eyes to complete darkness. There was something covering my shoulders upward and over the lower parts of my legs and feet, but my bare torso was exposed. I tried calling for help, but with this covering on me and my head wound throbbing, it came out as a whimper. I heard a cluttering above me, as if something was chiseling away at rock. Each clatter caused me to flinch my stomach. Terrified the chisel was going to impact with my flesh. It was horrific. That sheer amount of fear. I can't explain how horrendous it was. I heard this fight, shouts, equipment being thrown about, and then silence. I desperately tried to unbind my hands as I lay there, helpless, but I couldn't help them free. I felt a hand press on my exposed stomach, which caused me to flinch like a scared animal. The next thing I knew, the cover was pulled off my face and my eyes met with Mason. He told me to calm down and began untying me. I saw the horror behind him. Kurt was slumped against the wall, his head lolled, and his arms. Chunks of flesh were hanging off in clumps, as if they'd been shredding. It was disgusting, and if it wasn't for being aware of my situation, I would have vomited there and then. And then Mason ushered me out of there. On my unsteady legs, I stepped over flung tools, a scalpel, hacksaw, and a chisel. I hesitated, frozen, knowing in my heart that those were all meant for me. "Rich, keep moving. Don't touch the red rocks," Mason said to me, before his words turned to a frantic yelp. Kurt had got him, his shredded hand gripping Mason's ankle. I saw Kurt reach into his pocket, and the next thing I saw was dust. Red dust thrown in Mason's face. He looked from Kurt to me, pure horror on his face, and then I saw it form in his eye, right in front of me. The black, wriggling form. Mason mouthed the word, "Run," at me. I slammed that door shut, but I couldn't bring myself to lock it. I couldn't lock Mason in there. And then I ran as fast as my Bambi legs could take me, a disoriented mess, all along the hallway. The base was a mass of destruction. Each of the rooms smashed up. All the radios, equipment, everything. It was chaos, and I had no way of calling for help. But I could hear footsteps in the hallway, and I knew they were coming for me. I crawled to the back of the mess room and hid behind a broken table, and I stayed like that, afraid of my own breathing sounds and twitches for hours, days. I'm not sure. Fear can freeze a person, can freeze all sense of time. When I knew I had to move, I found the main door wide open with a gust of snow and ice heaped inside, but I sensed that they'd gone, left. It was only me now. I found a down jacket and packed my bag full of supplies, and then I left too. I knew what I needed to do. I needed to go take the route down to the harbor, which I'd last been at when we arrived. They still did trips on that side of the island. It would be my best shot of getting off this island alive. When I passed that same slope that led to that cave, I spotted it sticking out of the ice. A boot. I knew I had to check that cave out, but I didn't want to. As I crept down the slope, pressing my hand against the damp rock to steady myself, I heard my breathing and footsteps echo. I walked into the mouth of the cave, and then I saw something staring back at me from within the cave wall itself. This face, frozen in fear. Farah. She was impaled in the ice, surrounded by those weird symbols, and her fists pressed to the icy prison as if she was trying to pound free as she died. I don't know what happened, how it was even possible, but I know what I saw. I fell to my knees and I pressed my hands to the icy barrier blocking her body, and I bawled my eyes out, ice forming on my cheeks. Then, when I had nothing left to cry, I stood up and I left. I headed for the harbor. As I saw the fenced area, I felt a sense of relief, as if I knew the evil stopped there. I can't explain it. I was stumbling toward it, and that's when I sensed eyes on me. I made myself reach that fence before I allowed myself to look back. But when I did, I saw him staring at me with an unfaltering gaze. That wriggling dot in his eye, visible even from there, and the chunks of flesh shredding off his bare torso, revealing the gunky tendons within. But in his hands, he held something, a piece of jagged red rock. Despite his harrowing appearance, I recognized him. I knew it was him. It was Mason. There was still some of that person left in there. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and then with a beating heart, I turned and I walked away. He didn't follow me, and I never saw him again after that. I should have done something. I shouldn't have just left him like that. He was my friend once. They all were. He saved my life. I made it to the harbor and I camped out there for days, weeks. I don't know for sure. I was out of food when the ship arrived. Between my frostbite and delirium, I heard the sailors say how they didn't know how I even survived. I left that place, but the torment of that island came with me. I know that much. The nightmares never left me. My friends. The bloodshed. The red rock, the icy corpse, the shredded skin, the wriggling black form in their eye. I never went back to work. Suited people showed up at my apartment, 2 of them, and they gave me a generous paycheck, enough to see me fit for life. They made me sign a non-disclosure agreement in exchange. I signed it. I wanted more than anything to forget, but the island wouldn't let me. Still to this day, I wake up ice cold, my skin almost raw from it, and I rush to the mirror to check. To check the wriggling black form isn't there in my eye. I shouldn't have left my friends like that. I shouldn't have done that to them. I regret that every single day. I've tied up loose ends here. I've made sure my funds are moved and my loved ones will have a secure future. But the island's been calling to me, and it's time to go back. It's time to set them free, while I'm still able-bodied enough to do it.
This account was told to Ellis Hayes, the attorney of Richard Long, on the 7th of April, 2019. 3 weeks later, Richard disappeared from his Washington home without a word and has never been heard from since. It was later uncovered that Richard had a medical condition that caused his motor functions to rapidly deteriorate. Richard believed that he had to do something while he still could, something involving that island. The laboratory Richard worked for refused to comment on that tainted mission. But those who knew Richard state that he was never the same when he returned from that island, and that he was always adamant that something was out there, something evil. The mystery of Deception Island remains, as do the mysteries that reside within it. Parasitic force, or an ancient evil, no one can say for sure, but something happened on that island. Something explainable. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.